Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Strong Stoic podcast. I am your host, Brandon Tumlin. Before I introduce my guest, allow me to announce that this podcast is part of the Walled Garden Podcast Network, which is essentially a bunch of podcasts by contributors of similar tone, of similar quality, of similar philosophical thought. I am a founding member of that community as a director, contributor, mentor, and philosopher because I align so much with their mission. And in fact, there's going to be some really, really big news coming out on that. It's an evolving project, of course, but there's some really big ideas at play here. We do want to become the premium philosophical society. And that's what we're aiming to do and to be. So consider checking that out at thewalledgarden.com. Again, the people involved in there are top-notch, talking about people like Simon Drew, Kai Whiting, Sharon LaBelle, authors Josh Bertolotti as well, and his podcast, who I do a lot of work with. So top-quality people, check out that, get involved now. Now, also, please allow me to thank my supporters on Patreon. If you want to support me there, I would much appreciate it. It's not expected, but it is deeply appreciated. Consider also joining my Telegram group chat where we talk about the podcast episodes. It's sort of a little Strong Stoic community on there, so please get involved in that. And also check out my articles on Medium and the Stoic Gym. Today I have the privilege of speaking with Shane Trotter. Shane is an author, an educator, and a strength and conditioning coordinator. His book, Setting the Bar, Preparing Our Kids to Thrive in an Era of Distraction, Dependency, and Entitlement, is a book that I often recommend to teachers, parents, or anyone else with kids in their lives, period, or anyone. I mean, it's just a great book. He's dedicated his life, essentially, to improving youth development, and my personal exchanges with Shane has led me to the conclusion that this guy really walks the walk just as much as he talks the talk. Now, this is his second time on the podcast, so for those Strong Stoic OGs, you'll recognize him and his deep wisdom. And in this episode, we actually focus on history, why it's important, what lessons we can take and extract from history, and why it's not as simple as saying, well, let's just focus on today's issues and ignore history. Without further ado, please welcome Shane Trotter. Really great to see you again, and I'm really excited to talk with you. And really, I guess I just want to talk about history. And I guess let me provide a bit of background on why this came up at all. I was actually having a discussion with someone, and I was telling her about a lot of the historical issues that have taken place in the 20th century, mostly around the Holocaust and some of the bad systems that we're all aware of now, the Holocaust and the Gulag and even Mao's China. And I was talking about how there's a real dark history there, right, that I know you appreciate as much as I do. And she asked me she didn't ask me a question. She said, almost as a way of brushing off the requirement to study history, while most people are concerned about today's issues. And it took me off guard at first. And now when I think back, I feel stupid that it took me off guard. But at the time, it was a bit of a conundrum for me, because I said, well, actually, that's interesting. Why can't we just focus on today's issues? And of course, I went and I thought about it, and then it all kind of logically made sense to me. But having read your book, which I recommend to a lot of people, Setting the Bar, you bring up the importance of history. And I know you're a history nerd just like me, and so I figured, and anytime I get a chance to talk to you, I'll bring you on. So I figured you'd be a great person to have for this. So I'm going to open it to you, and just because I know you're really into history, why do you think it's important, or however you want to, I guess, start this discussion?
I don't know that you can understand the modern world if you don't understand history. It's really hard to put the world into context and to stack events into context. But more than that, I don't think we can, as a human species, be very successful long term if we don't especially understand the 20th century, which is a very it's kind of the century to understand, and to understand these stakes of living in the modern world. So the word stakes comes to mind. Not the delicious kind, but like there are high stakes. To human
Right.
civilization itself is a pretty special thing. It's more vulnerable than a lot of people like to think, and it's especially more vulnerable given the amazing technology that we are beneficiaries of, but also that uh, that uh, we have to utilize to our own benefit, or we could destroy ourselves with. Um, but it goes, not to defer from that too quickly, but it goes even bigger than that. So many people don't understand how to eat well because they don't understand the history of the human species, and that you know how you eat is actually going to be it only makes sense if you think about um, what humans ate traditionally throughout time. To someone who does not understand history, they cannot understand the fact that Pop Tarts are not a normal breakfast. That is just this completely abnormal thing to the human species. That through 99.999% of human history, these things were not possible. That all humans throughout history have uh, been involved in producing their own food, and that food only came from nature. Um, so, there's that. There's, understanding mental health and what's going on with mental health. To me, it's like, well, you have to understand history and the environments that humanity has evolved to thrive in, and then compare that to this bizarre environment we live in today. If you don't understand history, you don't. My grandmother, for example, 2 generations ago, grew up in Dallas, near where I live now, and her entire family her entire family slept outside all summer on their upstairs balcony, um, because they did not have AC. Uh, so we take these things for granted, and there's a great book I'm sure you're familiar with called the Comfort Crisis by Michael Easter, uh, and much of our many of our issues today stem from not understanding the environment we're meant to thrive in, and to understand that really takes some historical context.
Hmm. So yeah, that's a really great place to start. So there's a couple things I noticed that you mentioned. First, you brought up the importance of recent history, 20th century, the atrocities committed there. But then you went back pretty much as far back as you can go to talk about evolution and the importance of understanding our evolutionary psychology and what led to that. What what came to mind as you were describing all that, especially like with the food and with our psychology, everything that we've taken from evolution, it almost seems to be like at the heart of this is the misunderstanding that we are blank slates as human beings, that when we come into the
Hmm.
world we're just blank slate, and then you can socially construct everything you want on top of that. And I think really you see this manifested in all kinds of ways today, where uh, we're having trouble today defining like what a woman is, what a man is, like
Sure.
these terms that we've defined for a very long time. And I don't know, does that ring any bells when you think about this nature versus nurture, this blank slate idea, where people they seem to think that we can just come to the world and identity is built upon you, as opposed to you coming with maybe not all of your baggage, but certainly a little bit of baggage.
Yeah, I it's interesting. We like to demonize, and we like to there's a great one of the great courses. They're on Audible, but they existed before. Um, Forget what the professor was who led it. You can basically listen to the top professors in the world give their courses through these great courses. And there's one called Utopia and Terror in the 20th century. and it kind of explains the intimate link between these uh, these utopian delusions, these programs to try to create a utopia, um, and the almost inevitable um, terror that came about as a consequence. So it's almost always through utopian ideas. So when you don't understand history, I think especially with modern technology, it's easy to conceive that the world should be uh, put into the order that we want it to be in, um, rather than that humanity has to bring itself into harmony with the world itself. So does that make sense? So rather than harmonizing yourself with the world, we think that we need to bend the world to our will. We don't accept these basic um, these basic truths of human civilization. One of them, just most fundamentally, human civilization is hard. It's a really hard thing. Um, the level of peace and prosperity we've appreciated in our lives is not normal. It's super rare, and it's not, you can't perfect humanity. Humanity is not perfectible. So it's not to say that we don't keep striving towards improvement. I personally, I was happy to see gay marriage, become a legal thing. We're never going to be there, and there's plenty to point out in the world that is messed up. But the idea, these utopian delusions, these ideas that we've become convinced of, that are worthwhile goals, aren't realistic, and people can't see that they're delusional. Um, you know, for, and so you get the concept creep there. But also, what comes with that is demonizing the modern world, and demonizing every institution, and every, demonizing America, and from what I've seen, with this unrealistic expectation that it would be perfect, that it should be perfect. Rather than it's kind of like what Winston Churchill said. Democracy is the the worst type of government there is, except for all the others. It's like, yes, it's not perfect. This is human relationships. Human civilization is a really hard thing, and history teaches you that. Morality, the social technology, values. These are social technologies, and so this kind of postmodern idea that you can get rid of values, that moral relativism is the path to, moral relativism is the goal, and kind of should be the understood, accepted program for a society to run. You know. We don't understand how devastating that is, not only to a civilization, but to the individuals within a civilization who have no way of connecting because of it. So,
Right. Yeah. There's a few things I want to pick out there. So you do talk a bit. It's been a little while since I've read your book, but you talk about utopia quite a bit. This delusion of utopia, and it's funny because I did a bit of reading on that last year, and it seems like it came from some of these islands of people where we meaning in the West and America, we have this idea that everything's perfect on these little small islands. But then when they actually went in and did research in there, they found that it was not the case at all. That this idea of like this pleasure island where everything's perfect, it's completely false. It doesn't exist. Yet we're still drawn to this idea of utopia. I mean, the Soviet Union, for example, they basically had the same. They've done the social experiment, as far as I'm concerned. They said something like, okay, listen, we're in a dead end in our social systems. Here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna rip this whole friggin' thing in half. We're gonna burn it to the ground, and we're all gonna suffer because of that. But then we're gonna build something from the ashes that's going to be better. And they tried that, and they actually said to the citizens, because this is so fresh in my mind because I just read about this, but they said to the citizens, it was basically like you guys have to suffer now. you have to suffer now so that the future generations can be better. And what that suffering looked like was, mass starvation, people unable to get food, people literally eating their children because they had no food. And what ended up happening, of course, in the end was that it failed. The system failed. So it almost seems to me like when we're aiming for perfection, it's like trying to think of like an analogy for it, but the best one I can think of on the spot here is kind of like building a house of cards. So when you build a house of cards, you make a little triangle, then you make another little triangle. Now, one of the worst things you can do when you're building a house of cards is try and make it perfect. Because what ends up happening is if you're trying to line up the edges of the cards perfectly, it's not going to make the house better. What it's going to do is it's going to fall apart. The whole damn thing is going to collapse. And so as we get closer to utopias, even though we can't fully achieve it, the closer we get to it and the closer we try and get to it, the more messing with something in aim of perfection has the possibility or the potential of destroying the whole thing to the ground.
Yeah, yeah. I'll give you another a good concept or construct. Have you heard of Chesterton's fence?
I think you told me about it before, but yeah, please explain.
It's basically the idea that if you don't understand, so say there's a field and there's a fence, right? And the fence, to outsiders is doing nothing and never served a purpose. And the idea is, some guy comes up and says, "Hey, should we tear this fence down? It's serving no purpose. It's not doing anything." Um, and the response, the appropriate response is, well, if you can't tell me why it was built in the first place, we certainly can't tear it down because it was built for a reason. It was certainly built for a reason. Humans don't tend to do things for no reason. So you're going to probably have some sort of unintended consequence if you cannot tell me what the initial purpose was. And that's kind of this thing that we often see is that if you're just trying to logically think through things in kind of game, utopianize the world, you are going to you're going to miss. There's going to be a lot of unintended consequences because you're going to not recognize some of the underlying purpose for traditions. Tradition, I forget the quote exactly, but it is a solution to a former set of problems. And if you can't figure out what that set of problems is before you ditch the tradition, you're probably going to on the backside deal with a lot of the ramifications. So I'll give an example of that. The Soviet Union, they decided that they knew they had to give their workers days off. They understood that people would be more productive if you gave them intermittent days off, like we get the weekend here in America, right? So the way they did that though was they arbitrarily assigned people to groups, and like A block group, you would go work, day off, work, day off, right? B group, it's a different it's a different rotation. So that way they would never have to shut down the factories. Every day the factories could be open because they just had a rotating, like you got your day off on a different rotational basis. But what happened is people, mental health disorders skyrocketed. People need connection and they need synchronization. All right, so it's really important for culture itself, for community itself, for people to have somewhat synchronized schedules. When people aren't synchronized, they tend to, mental health at the most fundamental level, connection is the path to mental health, right? And so when you discourage connection, you see those issues. It's another reason that in light of the decline of religion, we've seen a lot of mental health issues increase, and that's a tricky thing. You can't force someone to believe in a religion, but at the same, and people are pulled by evidence one way or the other. So I would I don't know what the right answer is to that for someone who doesn't believe. And yet, the importance of religions historically to communities, to connection, and to mental health is tremendous. And often we point to the negatives of religion, which are obvious too, the negatives of dogma, as a rationale for this is just bigoted stuff that holds back progress, and the world would be good without it, or better without it, without recognizing it was the social technology that allowed us to have any sort of civilization. And that promoted so much mental health, so much, you know, so much community. Um, that's kind of one of the things you get often when you don't learn your history. I would say is you invite all these unintended consequences because you don't reconcile with the world as it really is.
Yeah, and that's a huge one, unintended consequences. And I've actually experienced this personally in my job. So I work on ships, and particularly barges, which is basically just a big rectangle of steel, right? So
Hmm.
you put stuff on barges all the time. You're welding stuff on there, and you're loading stuff on there. But every now and then, if you look around, you'll see these weird structures all over the place, or maybe like a weird hook. And when I actually started this job, I actually cut off some of that stuff because I didn't know what the hell it was for. I said, "What? It's in the way. Let me just get rid of this." And it turns out
Hmm.
that it actually had a use. I just wasn't
Sure.
seeing it in my insufficiency as a someone who's on boats at the time. So now here's something that's interesting because I've heard a critique on this, and basically the critique was, well, yeah, if we make a change, there could be unintended consequences, but there's going to be unintended consequences anyway. And that's flawed reasoning because no, there doesn't necessarily have to be a change. And this is where you get into the argument of tradition, of being
Hmm.
conservative in your approach sometimes. And it's fascinating to me because as an engineer, being conservative is what you do. you, if you're going to design
Hmm.
something, you don't want to be liberal in your approach. You want to be conservative. Why? Because being conservative works. If putting 4 nails in that piece of wood has been proven to work, but your engineering says 2, you probably want to put 4 in anyway because you're using a conservative approach. I don't know what would you say to that? I guess critique of, well, yeah, there's always going to be unintended consequences.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of hubris there to think that the unintended consequences of uh, to think that you're you're going to outsmart the passed on traditions and the passed on wisdom of uh, thousands of previous people, uh, and that your unintended consequences are going to be less than what we've seen in history. Um, and the examples abound. So yesterday I had an interview for a different podcast, and the interviewer brought up that a friend of his, a smart person, PhD, uh, said that he couldn't believe that COVID didn't change school forever. That we didn't decide to go to this virtual model because we figured out finally how to do it, and it would be so much more convenient, and we could streamline everything, and it seemed to be what the future was. Sorry, I'm getting in.
Antoine McCullough, if you're in the building, can you please come to the front desk? Antoine McCullough, if you're in the building, can you please come to the front desk? Thank you.
That's rare during the summer, so I apologize for
No
that.
worries. That's awesome.
So, speaking of schools, the it's more convenient to be online, and you can streamline things and all these things. So he couldn't believe that we didn't take this new capacity to do virtual school and keep it permanently. Now, the obvious thing is that the mental health effects of staying at home all day and not getting out of your house are tremendous, especially for adolescents. I think that it's pretty obvious that it's the same is the case for people who, it always seems wonderful. It always seems nice to be able to start working from home. But to be able to work remotely. But I've seen over and over again friends of mine who get that. Now they have the luxury to do their laundry in between, things like that, and they all hate it. After a while, they all wish they could go in. They miss the community. They miss being part of something. They miss the connection. Yeah, the hubris of thinking that your solution is going to be better than the solution that has come out of the refinery of history, basically. I mean, history is a refinery for the best social mechanism, and I think a lot of this comes from there's kind of two twin things that exist in the individual or the modern world and the progressive ethos, which is hyper individualization and this love of safety and convenience, this deification of safety and convenience as the highest good, and what comes from that is a lack of understanding of how important the immeasured things are, and how important the social order is. So if you want to look at just what Durkheim's he's really the founder of sociology, and he saw that suicides increased with alienation. The less connected you were with your society, the less integrated you were through organizations, whatever they might be, whether that's religion, a school, whatever it is, the less integrated you were, the less connected, the fewer connections you have, the less deep those connections are, the more likely you are to commit suicide. It's pretty straightforward. So we rely on a vibrant social order, something called social capital, which is basically the trust felt between people in a culture. We rely on that for our mental health at the most fundamental level. And yet that gets overlooked most of the time when we talk about mental health, because we live in a hyper-individualistic society. And so we want to create this convenient world that's frictionless, where no one has to waste any time at any point. There's no none of these inconveniences of modern relationships, or of living in a culture where you have to mediate yourself and your immediate desires to those of other people, like walking through the grocery store. Don't do that. You can now do grocery pickup, which I do, by the way, but I have two kids in elementary school, so that's my excuse. Or not, or pre-K, I should say. But and so like to see this through, I was being interviewed on a podcast yesterday where the host asked me, he said he has a friend who's a PhD who is just shocked that public schools have not stuck with the virtual learning model. He thought that post-COVID, that was going to be the model that stuck. It seems so obvious that if we can do this, it's so much more convenient, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So of course you see these awful mental health effects to the year in virtual schooling. And the mental health stuff was going on already, and it's been amplified. But it was amplified by the year of virtual schooling for most students. Students need connection. People need connection. We see the same things when often people are really excited about the opportunity to have a remote work job, a job where they don't have to go in the office, where they can work at home. And very often they regret that, and they talk about how much they miss the connection, the community they had there. It was inconvenient. There were these little things that bugged them, and yet they'd take it all back if they could. And it's the same way with school. There are being in a physical school, not going to school on your screen. It is less convenient. You have to wake up. You have to put clothes on. You have to look at yourself in the mirror before you leave. You have to do all these things. You have to go outside and have sunshine. Oh, it's so dang inconvenient. These are vital things for human thriving. Like to be an actual human, you have to be connected. You need to go outside. And so yeah, it's not as convenient, but of course that's not the end all be all. So there's this propensity to, when you're in a utopian mindset, when you're ignoring history and thinking forward of what would it look like if it was perfect, we tend to think very individualistically through only our lens, where we don't have to mediate the wants and desires and personality types of those other people in society, where we don't have to bring our own selfishness into harmony with a broader community. And we tend to deify things like safety and convenience without without realizing the ramifications of doing that. And of course, to go back to that example of virtual schooling, the other thing that we saw with virtual schooling was that the majority of students would took tons of liberties. They didn't turn their cameras on. They logged in, but they were on their phone more. That there is this social accountability thing that's good too. It's good to be part of a community. It's good to be connected with not only the people around you, but with a tradition. That's another place where history comes in. It's essential to see yourself as part of a tradition. To see yourself as part of something bigger than you. And implicit in that is a respect for history, a respect for the tradition that you're a beneficiary of. We right now, free speech, there's some people that all of a sudden free speech, this most vital thing to the Republican democratic tradition, is being challenged in many respects because free speech could be offensive to someone or whatever it is, and we don't realize how amazing that free speech, that competition of ideas, how many things we benefit from, that were only possible because that's kind of been the backbone belief of our tradition. So it's just a respect and an appreciation for the world that you are a beneficiary of, that comes from understanding history as well.
Yeah, I want to say something very quick here about free speech, because I think free speech is the very thing that allows you to strengthen those old traditional ideas without bloodshed. That's one of the things that, yeah, it's one thing, okay, you get to speak freely, blah, 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 but like, why do you need to do that? One of the reasons, even if somebody is saying something that's completely against what we know and understand, even something that everyone, like 99% of the population understands, it's still a good thing for that 1% to speak whatever they think the truth is, so that it gives us a chance to reinforce why that idea is there in the first place. That gets back to your idea about Chester's fence. Now, what's really fascinating to me, so as you were talking about this convenience thing, how we're valuing convenience, I've done that myself of the past couple of years. I bought a house last year, pretty much a year from today, actually, and I always wanted a home gym. Mm-hmm. And so I spent like the last year buying good equipment and this and that, and my reasoning was it's going to be convenient. I don't need to drive to the gym. I can go anytime I want. I can play loud music if I want. I can be, if I'm really busy, I can like not clean up that day, clean up at a later date, that kind of thing. But after doing it for a while, I've came to the conclusion that actually, no, it's not the best thing. It's not the best thing at all. The reason is because you're missing the community, but something else that you mentioned there too, where kids are turning off their cameras, is you start to lose your standard. So
Yes.
when you go to a gym, when you go in a community, there's certain requirements that you have to do. You have to clean up after yourself. You have to stay tidy around your place. You have to respect other people's music choices. You can't walk in front of someone when they're lifting if you're at a weightlifting gym. There's these what would you say, these rules of these group rules. It's something like that, these gym rules, that when you're by yourself, sure, you have all the freedom, sure, you can do whatever you want, but the question is that good for you?
Yes.
Is it good for you to have ultimate freedom? And I would say that for probably no, depending, obviously it's very nuanced, but probably you don't want complete and utter freedom. Let me just sum up something here, and then I'm going to get you to respond to this. So basically what we just spent the last, I guess, 30 minutes or so talking about was that one of the biggest reasons why we need to study history is because maybe there's something there. Maybe the current solution isn't as terrible as you seem to think. Maybe it's there for a reason, and maybe your solution to that problem has unintended consequences. And I would say that as an extension to that, as we mentioned earlier with the Soviet Union, sometimes someone else has already tried the damn solution that you think is going to fix the problem, and it didn't work.
Sure. Yes, the historical record is full of fascinating experiments, human experiments that don't work for whatever reason. It's full of that, and that's an amazing reason to study history. Is there's so much we don't understand humanity, human relationships, and human flourishing. That it's not this easily gamed, quantifiable thing. It doesn't follow an exact science. It's a very messy, interesting thing that requires a competition of ideas and in a variety of different perspectives in order to be optimized. And that's the beauty of the system that we are beneficiaries of. And but yeah, you cannot game it. It's the variables are too infinite. To go to your gym example, there's a phenomenal book. Matthew Crawford. All his books are phenomenal. His most recent one is even better in my opinion. It's called Why We Drive, where he really looks at the cost of safety, of hyper safetyism and convenience, and makes an argument for why a world of self-driving cars would be the worst thing possible. It's a fantastic book. But before that, he wrote a book called The World Beyond Your Head. And he gives the example of a gym where the two different gyms. His original gym was kind of just your traditional 80s, early 90s style gym. And that's the one he grew up in. And it was very communal. And there was a culture there, and everyone knew everyone there, and they played music just to everyone, and it was kind of there were these unwritten rules, bro rules if you want, like for figuring out what music was played. And if you didn't like the music, you had to convince the group to change. You had to, or just deal with it. You had to, and you had to, and that's a good skill for people to have. It's one of those meta skills. But then he gets older and he goes to a gym, kind of a Globo gym, and they're playing this, piping this music in. And this is, I guess, pre-earbuds, where he didn't walk around with earphones in. Or I guess he did. He mentions that. Everyone's wearing earphones, listening to their own. And of course they're wearing earphones, because he says the music that they're playing to the general public throughout the gym, piping in, is awful. And everyone hates it. He starts talking to people. Is this not the most ridiculous? So anyone who doesn't have earphones is like, yeah, it's horrible. So he goes to the front desk to make the suggestion that hey, we could change the music, couldn't we? Like, no one likes this here. And the person at the front desk is kind of taken aback, like, well, I can't do that. You can't do. And so it's kind of this world of like, well, I don't. That's the most bizarre request in the world. I have no control over the music, right? And I don't know if this connects to history, but it's a fascinating thing. It does, because in the traditional way, when you're part of a community, you're you, everything is you're connected to the world. Everything is mediated socially. And what happens in this kind of hyper convenience-ized, commoditized gym world is that uh, you just fall into your individual bubble, and the whole thing is it's an experience that you don't get to participate in, and I feel like that is part of what's going on, with history, is that we're not experiencing the world as something that we participate in, as much as something that we should be able to turn into a commodity that we consume. Maybe that's a little bit too philosophical, but
No, it's impossible on this podcast, buddy.
but again, the meta skill is there. What we see is this overemphasis on convenience and on the metrics that we determined ahead of time were important. And whatever metrics we didn't determine ahead of time get thrown by the wayside, and often they're the immeasurables that are so important. You ask people what are the most important lessons in school. They're often not what was taught. They're the meta lesson, the fact that I failed a test, I got behind, I had to catch up. These are the meta lessons of life that are so much more important than anything else. That can't be taught through a program. They have to be experienced through the world.
Yeah. And I would say that the gym example that you use there is completely relevant to history, because what happens is we all go through this when we're young, right? You're born into a system, you're born into a tradition, a community, a family, and you want change. And the reason you want change is because it's oppressive. And it is oppressive. It has to be oppressive by nature. Again, sure, you have more freedom working out alone, but is that the best thing for you? Probably not. So here's the thing. No matter what system you're born into, there's going to be an element of oppression in there, because in order for you to fit into the group, you're going to have to follow certain rules. But the benefit of that is that there's a place for you. The benefit of that is that you actually belong somewhere. Now, I have to say the caveat that some traditions, some cultures, some families that you're born into are terrible. And that's what makes it so tricky. But you can't just assume that it's terrible. And again, this gets back to the importance of figuring out why these systems exist in the first place, what has been tried in the past, what has failed, and maybe not, but maybe what we have right now is the best that it could possibly be, or maybe it's the best that it's ever been in history. You don't know, but until you've done your due diligence and studied history properly, you cannot really say that with confidence.
Yeah, and I think that's the key point. I would never argue that we can't make progress, or that we have reached the pinnacle. But I would argue that you cannot understand human nature and human organizations, and how to improve as society. You cannot understand it in any way, shape, or form if you don't understand history. And Furthermore, and this is something we haven't touched on yet, you have to understand history to understand the high stakes that we live in today. You have to understand history to understand what it is to be a citizen in the modern world, and how vulnerable we are if we can't preserve certain institutions, and we can't. I'll give you an example. How can you design a good school curriculum to create good citizens who are prepared for the world they're going to inherit if you don't understand history? how can you? So, but I don't think you can prepare someone for the world if you don't understand history. You, you don't understand um, because then you don't understand the great stakes. First of all, how readily or how easily utopian ideas have been converted into violence. But more than that, you don't understand the unique context that we live in. You don't understand what it is what a nuclear attack would be like and what the cost of that nuclear attack would be. You don't understand the, you know, the, the history of disinformation and what the capacities going forward would be. So to be able to look forward intelligently, I think requires a looking back intelligently and an understanding of of past events and and just
Yeah.
uh, not only past events but uh, past the flaws of past efforts to create perfection.
Yeah, that's it. That's it right there. Yeah. And we have two great examples happening right now. We have Russia invading Ukraine, and we have tension between the US, China, and Taiwan. Like
Yeah.
for like you can't even think about these matters without knowing why there's tension in the first place. And you certainly can't think of a solution. So you might think, well, yeah, war is bad. Let's just not go to war. Okay, okay. Well, that's a very naive approach. Let's back up a little bit and have a look at the history. And I don't want to get too bogged down with the specifics of this, but I do want to ask you, leading in, I guess, to towards the ending here, because we've talked a lot about generalities, but I'm curious on a personal note, what has been one of the most or the most impactful things that you've learned in history, whether it's Soviet Union or whether it's the Holocaust or whether it's a particular person that's been through something? Is there anything that comes to mind as like that has personally impacted you?
Gosh, there there are so many. I like to World War II is almost cliche in how popular it is of an answer, but World War II is it's popular. It's the most popular history to review, but I think rightly so. It's so complex.
Yeah.
So I think the lessons, you got Stalin, you have Hitler. There's so much there. You have Hannah Arendt coming out of that, and the understanding of the banality of evil that we get. The Stanley Milgram experiments that follow that up. I think that the insight into human psychology that we got from World War II is invaluable. Really invaluable for thinking about the world accurately in the modern context. For understanding what is required for dealing with the massive technology we have. Um, and understanding also the power of propaganda. And this
Yeah.
is something that we've been slow to appreciate. The propaganda still holds such sway in our world, but it's now called marketing. And this is something that you've got to study history to understand. It's fascinating. Um, Freud, his nephew Edward Bernays, writes the book Propaganda following World War One, where he talks about basically what it is to do a public a campaign for public to persuasion, right? Um, and then he goes on and takes that book Propaganda and takes that roadmap and he creates the modern marketing world. He creates modern marketing. This is the guy. He did just these brilliant things. The reason that the all American breakfast is eggs and bacon. That's something he coined. He has all these things. But his approach is taking his uncle Sigmund Freud's revelation of that the unconscious mind is responsible for so much human behavior, and learning how to manipulate people in mass based on that, and how to embed desires and wants and beliefs. And what we've seen, since World War II, and this is just reading the history, is the explosion of this marketing, this field of marketing, using the television, understanding the history of what technologies have done to mass persuasion. Starting with the radio, you could do this too. But we've seen the growth of marketing, and marketing as the most fundamental source of human values in Western societies, as traditional sources of human values have been degraded. And then you insert the smartphone, and this is, understanding what's happening in modernity. To do so, to understand the human revolution that we're living through, you have to understand the history and what happened in the 50s with the television. We're just seeing this dramatic, exponential exacerbation of this issue. Okay, of the fact that now, marketing is being targeted to you based off of your past decisions, your past clicks on that device that is with you at all times, and the power that these things have. The average person really does not understand how powerful this technology they put in their pocket is, because they don't understand the history. And to give you more context about what is so important to understand, Robert Putnam, social scientist, he wrote a book called Bowling Alone in the mid-90s, where he tracks the history of the U.S. and of social participation in the U.S., and basically found that communities were dying in the United States, that there was this tremendous drop in community participation and community connection, community ethos, and reciprocally mental health in the United States that started in the 60s. So people were not participating in communities, they weren't joining things, that there's this dramatic thing happening. He pointed to four major factors, but he said none of them held a candle. Of the four, by far the most influential is what happened with the television, the explosion of television consumption. Early 1950s, less than 10% of households have a television. By 1960, over 90%. By the mid 80s, the average household has 4. So this has this dramatic effect on American society and American values. This is, of course, only amplifying the effects of Edward Bernays' marketing revolution. And to understand what is going on with the social revolution of the smartphone and social media, you have to start there, and seeing how those effects that Robert Putnam is talking about are going to be amplified by a technology that is a screen in your pocket. So that's very long-winded, but I think it's one of many examples that you can point to where you can't understand what's going on in modernity if you don't understand history.
The propaganda thing is probably the most underappreciated. And it's crazy to even consider that as a possibility, because, as you mentioned, we're so bombarded by propaganda in so many ways, in every possible way that you could imagine. You have propaganda in your pocket, yes. Right? You carry it around with you. In a sense, you can't even get away from it. And that was, propaganda was how we won D-Day. It's how we actually won the war. That's how we or started the turn of the tide, right? It was we fooled the Nazis into thinking that we were going at place X and we went at place Y, and that was like the turning point of the war for the Allies. And it's easy to look at that and say, well, yeah, in that case, propaganda is good. But I guess if you look at also the propaganda was the thing that started the war as well. And it was the thing that allowed Nazi Germany to become Nazi Germany, as well as Soviet Russia to become Soviet Russia. I think there's a couple things that make World War II, because I like that you mentioned World War II, even though it is the obvious answer. But there's it's not arbitrary. There's something very there's a deep underlying reason or reasons why World War II is so profound, and to me anyway. The first is that it was really well documented. We've never had a war on that scale with that much documentation. Sure, we have lots of Kublai Khan's adventures and war, but it's written down. Like, we have actual video footage of World War II. So we've sorry, I'm just shaking the desk here, but we've never had any scale, any documentation to that scale on any war. And the second point, which you alluded to there, was that World War II is when we reached the point where our technological growth threatened human survival as a species, not your human survival as an individual. It threatened humanity's joined survival. And that's what makes that so profound. The reason why peace was negotiated at the end, and of course there was a Cold War afterwards that lasted probably way too long than it should have, but the reason for that was because we recognized that as countries, as leaders, as individuals, that, oh shit, if we keep going here, it's not going to be destruction for the other side. It's going to be mutual destruction. And maybe we better start thinking about peace. So you talk about why this has been one of the longest periods that we've had world peace, in the grand scheme of things. That's why. It's because we know
Yes.
we've reached that point, and that point was during World War II, near the end of it. Great stuff. So I'll let you bounce off that, but then once you respond to that, I want to poke you about how do you teach kids about such very dark topics, because that's one of the things as well. We talk about, like, obviously bringing kids up with history, but it's also a lot of darkness. There's a lot of darkness in there. So how do you go about doing that as a teacher and as a father?
Well, first, your point is exactly right, and so just to reiterate, I don't think you can design a good education system without understanding that I need to create a citizen capable of living in this world, who understands. Like, I need to create a voter who understands, the gravity of the things they're voting on, and the gravity of the decisions that the people they elect will have to face. That can put these things in context. And also an education system that understands the power of propaganda, and it first and foremost sets out to create a citizen capable of overcoming incessant propaganda, which we call which is now marketing. But it's to seek truth, and to understand how to seek truth, and to understand the vulnerabilities of the human mind and human cognitive bias. I mean, these are not common things to teach people. They're not common parts of the education path, and to me, that's absurd. But of course, I'm a history guy, so that's what informs that opinion. To your next question, how do you talk about these things with children, with my children, with high school students? Obviously, it's gradual. You don't you don't start. There are things that a 5-year-old cannot grasp. This isn't a perfect illustration, but there's the conservation of volume. Jean Piaget is a famous developmental psychologist, and basically you have two small glasses, same size glass, filled with water to the exact same point. You take one of those glasses, pour it into a tall, thin glass, and you ask a kid, which one has more. He saw that they were even, and then he poured it into another glass. He'll still tell you the tall, thin one has more water in it, even though he saw that they were equal just a second before.
Right.
And then at age 7, all of a sudden you don't have to teach them. All of a sudden, 7-year-olds, it's right at age 7 about, 7-year-olds they know that, well, they're still equal. They just automatically understand the conservation of volume. So all that's to say, there is a developmental age appropriate way to teach these things, right? There are don't don't sit your 5-year-old down and talk about Hitler and all that. It's just not going to be. But one of the things that at a young age, I think it's important that we don't shelter our kids from reality at every turn. And ways you can do that, for example, is the death. We hide death from our children, and we refuse to be honest, or or to talk about it. So this past year, my wife lost her grandfather and grandma, literally 2 days apart. Her maternal grandfather and paternal grandmother both died, and so there was, it was their week. It was a rough week, and we talked about death with our kids. We talked about what happened, and it's this kind of recurring thing that comes up, um, and I think that's important. I think it's important and I think it's important for parents to be honest too. Uh, in, whatever that looks like for you, So my son asked me the other day. He's 5 now, and he asked me the other day, uh, "Hey, if if uh, if God created people, who created God?" And I'm like, "Dang, dude! Like, you're gonna be awesome." But in my head, it's like, I, buddy, that's a great question. I don't know the answer. So just showing that vulnerability, and gradually, uh, not having the certainty, and not hiding reality from them. That we don't always know the answer, that there are some scary things out there. That's early on, not hiding death, the idea of death from kids. You say the word die around a 5-year-old, and a lot of parents are like, you know what I mean? And so there are just some realities that throughout history, all civilizations, all children have grown up just accepting and being exposed to. And so not over sheltering at a young age. But then, of course, as they get older, I think if there's anything I think we do in public education today, it's that we make school boring by sanitizing every subject to make it as inoffensive as possible, rather than preparing our kids to have these very complex conversations and being exposed to these very complex topics in a environment where there could be a teacher that teaches them how to do that constructively. That's the obviously, that would be the ideal, is to take kids and let them have these conversations openly, honestly, in an environment where there is a mature developmental expert there to guide. But instead, we just hide from that. We make it so that these topics are taboo in school, and pretend kids aren't going to come to them on their own. For example, try to bring up porn in school, in a class conversation. That would not go over well. Parents would be mad. It would be super tricky. Kids would be shocked that you even said the word. And I don't know the best way to go about that, but I do know that by the time they're 14, most studies will show that nearly every guy has watched porn. And that they have a device in their pocket that is just making it infinitely accessible. And that there are dramatic effects to a society where that is the norm. And yet, we can't even we can't talk about these things. To talk about, CRISPR technology, to talk about the black ball, Nick Bostrom's black ball technology hypothesis. These are really interesting things that kids would light up to discuss, and they have to be capable of thinking through these complex, issues, and yet they're never exposed to them. You know what I mean? Obviously they're not of an age where they're going to have the right decision. Here in Texas, gosh, we're not going to even bring up the debate over climate change with kids, because that could upset parents. So to me, you have to talk about history, the realities of history, the realities of life, of relationships. It's such a wasted opportunity not to teach these things and to sanitize education from these things that actually give it life and make it relevant.
Yeah, I think that we need to relearn that being offended is not the worst thing. Being offended
Sure.
is probably the best evil. Out of all the evils, being offended, what's the alternative? War, suicide from depression because you're not facing reality, no meaningful relationships, not a meaningful life. Far, 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 far worse than being offended.
Fragility going forward, just
and
being a fragile person who's afraid to expose yourself to the world.
Yeah, and you mentioned that as well in your book. That I remember that distinctly. That people are tough. It's not the case that if you do it properly and you educate children about some of these harsher truths and the way that reality is, it's not that they're going to just flounder and fail. It's like people are actually tough. We're resilient, but it needs to be done in a way. You can't just go into the gym and squat 500 pounds on your first day. You have to build it up over time. But ultimately, we have the capacity to lift that weight. We just need the time, and we need it done properly, and we need good parents to do that for us.
And there are going to be times where it's not done in a perfect progression. And what history has shown is that people bounce back really good from what social psychologists call potentially traumatic events. The majority of them are not traumatic, and that people are surprisingly resilient. So there's that too, that you can be pushed. You can, sometimes life is gonna show you something, gonna push you hard, and you're probably gonna recover a lot better than if you were never exposed to any resistance at all. So yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, adversity, resistance. You can't get stronger without breaking the muscle down. You can't do it, and you do that by loading the body. So first of all, I'm going to thank you just tremendously for coming on and talking with me again. I always learn a lot from you and always enjoy talking with you. I do want to give you an opportunity here to mention your book, because I think everyone should read it, but especially if you're a teacher, and especially if you're a parent, I think you really need to read this book. So please mention your book and where people can find you, and any final words of wisdom.
Thank you. Yes, the book is called Setting the Bar, Preparing Our Kids to Thrive in an Era of Distraction, Dependency, and Entitlement. I often describe it as the book that I could not write. It was burning to get out, and given my experience in education, I'm convinced that if you accept the cultural programming that is normal, there's no way of being a flourishing human in the modern world. So I would I try to clarify a path, not just to being okay, but a path to flourishing in modernity, to recognizing the environment for what it is and learning how to make it an amazing time to grow up and to live. So thank you for suggesting that. It certainly was the most exciting project of my life thus far. And the best place to find me, trottershane.com is my website, trottershane.com, and you can get, there's an email, the way to email me through there, as well as my social media there.
Definitely recommend the book. I said everyone should read it, especially if you have children in your life. Thanks again, Shane, so much. I hope it's not the last time you're on and we get to chat. So thanks again, and until next time.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks, Brandon.
Bye, everyone.